History, they say, is written by the victors. It's a grand, sweeping narrative, polished and refined until it fits a comfortable, familiar shape. In the story of American music, we know the names of the victors by heart. They are the Titans, the Mount Rushmore figures whose faces are carved into our collective memory, the Hanks, the Patsies, the Johnnies. Their stories are told and retold, their legends growing with each passing year. But history is never that simple. It's a rambling house with countless hidden rooms and forgotten corridors. And in those quiet spaces, you'll find the stories of the architects, the innovators who drew the blueprints, who laid the foundations, who blazed the trails that the Titans would later walk. This is a story about one of those forgotten architects, a ghost at the banquet of country music history. He was a man whose lightning-quick wit could light up the hallowed stage of the Grand Ole Opry, whose nimble fingers brought an exhilarating, dangerous new sound to the airwaves, and whose infectious energy helped to shape the very definition of what we now call country music. He was a masterful singer, a brilliant multi-instrumentalist, a side-splittingly funny comedian, and a true visionary who refused to be confined by any single category. His name was Hank Penny. He was a pioneer who had the audacity to take the sophisticated jazz-infused swinging sounds of the American Southwest and plant them directly in the heart of conservative traditional Nashville. He carved out a space for innovation, for improvisation, and for laughter in a town that often valued solemnity above all else. He stood toe-to-toe with the biggest stars of his day, captivated massive audiences with his undeniable charm, and gave a crucial first break to musicians who would go on to become legends themselves. Yet today, his name often draws a blank stare, a footnote in a story he helped to write. How does this happen? How does a man of such immense talent and foundational influence become, in essence, erased from the popular memory? This is a story not just about music, but about the capricious, often cruel nature of fame, the relentless march of time, and the quiet dignity of a legacy that is just waiting to be rediscovered. So let's turn the dial back, tune into that forgotten frequency, and pull back the curtain on the life and times of the remarkable and remarkably overlooked Hank Penny. To truly understand Hank Penny, you first have to understand the world that was crying out for a sound like his. You have to picture America in the 1930s. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic event. It was a psychological trauma that had settled deep into the bones of the nation. For millions, life was a daily struggle against dust, poverty, and a gnawing sense of hopelessness. In this bleak landscape, any form of escape, any flicker of joy was a precious commodity. And more than anything else, people wanted to dance. The dance halls that dotted the landscape, especially in the sprawling Southwest, weren't just places of entertainment. They were sanctuaries. They were community centers where, for a few hours on a Saturday night, you could forget your troubles, hold someone close, and move to a rhythm that made you feel alive. It was in these dance halls and on the powerful radio stations that broadcast their signals for hundreds of miles across the flat plains that a thrilling new kind of music was being born. It wasn't country, it wasn't jazz, it wasn't blues, and it wasn't pop. It was all of those things smashed together into a vibrant, irresistible gumbo. They called it Western swing. Imagine the ingredients. Start with the old-time fiddle tunes carried into Texas and Oklahoma by Anglo settlers from Appalachia. Add the rhythmic polkas and waltzes brought by German and Czech immigrants. Stir in the raw, emotional cry of the blues, learned from black sharecroppers and traveling musicians. Then pour in the sophisticated chord structures and improvisational fire of the hot jazz records coming out of New Orleans, Kansas City, and New York. Sprinkle it with the lively rhythms of Mexican mariachi and Tejano music from across the border. This was the sonic stew of Western swing. It was a music born of the American melting pot itself, diverse, energetic, and utterly unique. The true fathers of this sound were band leaders like Milton Brown and his musical brownies, who in the early 30s were the first to consistently blend these styles and feature improvised hot solos. But the man who would become the genre's charismatic king, its undisputed superstar, was a fiddler and bandleader from Texas named Bob Wills. With his band, the Texas Playboys, Wills created a sound that was simply electrifying. They used a full rhythm section with drums and bass, unheard of in traditional country music, along with amplified steel and standard guitars, a horn section, and a battery of fiddles. On stage, Wills was a magnetic presence, punctuating the music with his famous high-pitched hollers, "Ah-ha." Western swing was dance music, first and foremost, designed to keep the floor packed all night long. It was sophisticated enough for the jazz fans, yet rustic enough for the country folk. It was the sound of a new modern America, and it was into this era of musical revolution and cultural upheaval that Herbert Henry Penny, known to the world as Hank, was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1918. Now, Birmingham was a world away from the dance halls of Tulsa and Fort Worth. Alabama was steeped in its own rich traditions, the deep gospel of the churches, the raw blues of the Black Belt, and the string band music of the surrounding hills. It was a place where musical traditions were deeply entrenched. But Hank Penny was born with a different kind of ear. He was a sponge, absorbing every sound that trickled out of the family radio. He heard the local country acts, but he also heard the sophisticated broadcasts of big band orchestras from Chicago and New York. From his earliest years, it was clear he was not just a musician, but a natural-born entertainer. He was blessed with a quick, razor-sharp wit, a boundless sense of humor, and an innate sense of comedic timing that was as much a part of his talent as his musical ability. He picked up the banjo first, a notoriously difficult instrument, and mastered it with ease. He then moved on to the tenor banjo, a staple of early jazz bands, before settling on the guitar as his primary instrument. He wasn't a showy virtuoso in the traditional sense. His gift was for rhythm, for taste, and for leading a band with an infectious, swinging pulse. His professional career began, as it did for so many, on the live local radio shows that were the lifeblood of any aspiring musician in the 1930s. This was the ultimate training ground. There were no second takes. You had to be able to play for hours, read ad copy, banter with the announcer, and, most importantly, connect with an unseen audience. Hank excelled at all of it. His charming personality and easygoing humor made him a natural on the air. In 1936, while still just a teenager, he formed his first significant band, the Radio Cowboys. And right there, in the heart of traditionalist Alabama, Hank Penny began his lifelong mission of pushing boundaries. He was leading a country band, but he was hiring musicians who could play jazz. He was playing for audiences who expected fiddle tunes, but he was sneaking in the complex chords and swinging rhythms of the music he heard coming out of the Southwest. This period was his laboratory. It was where he learned how to be a band leader, how to arrange songs, and, crucially, how to use his humor as a bridge. He figured out that if he could make an audience laugh, he could get them to open their ears to something new. His Alabama band was a proving ground, a place to test his unique formula of hot music and hilarious comedy. But Hank was ambitious, and he knew, with the certainty of a true visionary, that Alabama was not big enough to contain his dreams. He was a Western swing band leader in a place where the genre barely existed. He was a big fish in a small and frankly uninterested pond. The real action, the epicenter of the musical earthquake he wanted to be a part of, was 1,000 miles away. The radio broadcasts, the music magazines, the stories from traveling musicians, they all pointed in one direction, west. By the early 1940s, California had become the new promised land for Western swing. The massive migration of Okies and other Southerners during the Dust Bowl had created a huge transplanted audience hungry for the sounds of home. Combined with the booming wartime economy that brought workers and soldiers from all over the country, Southern California became a vibrant, chaotic, and incredibly fertile ground for music. Huge dance halls like the Venice Pier and the Trianon Ballroom could hold thousands of dancers, and the competition between band leaders was fierce and cutthroat. This was the territory of Spade Cooley, a fiddler and showman whose massive orchestra was creating a slicker, more polished version of Western swing. To make it in California was to make it at the highest level. For Hank Penny, the call was irresistible. Around 1945, he packed his bags, gathered his ambitions, and headed for the coast. This wasn't just a career move. It was a pilgrimage. He was heading into the heart of the storm, an ambitious and largely unknown outsider from Alabama, ready to test his unique blend of hot picking and sharp wit against the biggest names in the business. He was leaving behind the familiar traditions of the Deep South for the glamorous, high-stakes world of the California music scene. The Alabama swing cat was about to see if he could conquer a new town, a bigger stage, and a far more demanding audience. The next chapter of his life, filled with triumph, frustration, and groundbreaking music, was about to begin. And so the ambitious innovator from Alabama arrived on the coast, a land of sunshine and seemingly limitless opportunity. But this was no empty frontier. The Western swing scene in Southern California was a fiercely guarded kingdom, with its own royalty, its own rules of engagement, and its own powerful reigning monarch. To succeed here would require more than just talent and ambition. It would demand grit, wit, and the nerve to challenge the very best in the business on their home turf. In the early 1940s, Southern California was more than just a place. It was an idea. It was the end of the road, the final destination for a generation of Dust Bowl refugees, ambitious dreamers, and wartime workers, all seeking a piece of the American promise under the warm Pacific sun. This massive influx of people from the Southwest brought with them a deep hunger for the music of home, and in the sprawling dance halls from San Diego to Santa Monica, that music was exploding. This was the kingdom of Western swing, and it was a kingdom with a fiercely competitive court. For Hank Penny, the charming and ambitious outsider from Alabama, arriving in this world was like stepping into the big leagues. This was where he would either forge his legend or fade into the background. The undisputed ruler of this kingdom was a man named Spade Cooley. Billed as the king of Western swing, Cooley was a brilliant fiddler and a consummate showman who fronted a massive orchestra, sometimes with upwards of 20 musicians. His sound was polished, sophisticated, and arranged with near symphonic precision. His shows were spectacular, tightly choreographed affairs that drew thousands of paying customers a night. Cooley was a star in the classic Hollywood sense, charismatic, handsome, and notoriously demanding, a perfectionist who ruled his band with an iron fist. He was the establishment. Into this world stepped Hank Penny, not with a massive orchestra, but with a smaller, leaner, and meaner outfit he called the Penny Serenaders. And he came armed with two weapons that Spade Cooley, for all his polish, couldn't quite match: a razor-sharp, spontaneous wit and a deep, abiding love for the hot, improvisational spirit of jazz. If Spade Cooley's band was a perfectly calibrated Cadillac, Hank Penny's was a stripped-down hot rod. It was less about smooth precision and more about raw energy, virtuosity, and, above all, having a good time. Penny immediately set about carving out his own territory in the cutthroat California scene. He and his band became fixtures at the sprawling Venice Pier Ballroom, playing to packed houses of rowdy, dance-crazed sailors and transplants. His strategy was brilliant. He couldn't out-orchestrate Cooley, so he would outswing him and outlaugh him. His shows were loose, unpredictable, and hilarious. Hank was the master of ceremonies, cracking jokes, bantering with his bandmates, and creating a party atmosphere that was infectious. But the comedy was always built on a foundation of world-class musicianship. Hank had an incredible ear for talent, and the Penny Serenaders were consistently staffed with some of the hottest players on the West Coast. He featured legendary steel guitarist Noel Boggs, whose jazz-influenced single-string solos were revolutionary. He employed virtuosic guitarists and fiddlers, and unlike many band leaders, he gave them the spotlight. A Hank Penny show wasn't just about the frontman. It was a showcase for every player on the stage. He encouraged long improvised solos, a direct inheritance from the freewheeling jam sessions of jazz. This made his band a favorite among serious musicians, who flocked to play with a leader who valued their artistry. This period also marked the beginning of his most significant recording career when he signed with the independent powerhouse King Records. Based in Cincinnati, King was a label known for its raw, gritty, and authentic recordings, specializing in what was then called race records, R&B, and hillbilly music. It was the perfect home for Hank's unfiltered, high-energy sound. The owner, Sid Nathan, famously told his artists and producers, "If you can get 'em patting their feet, they'll buy the record." Hank Penny's music was the very definition of foot patent music. His recordings from the mid to late 1940s are a treasure trove of American popular music. There was the novelty hit, Bloodshot Eyes, a humorous tale of a man confronting his cheating wife, which became a signature tune, but it was his instrumentals that truly showcased the band's prowess. Tunes like Steel Guitar Stomp and Penny Blows His Top were blistering showcases for his soloists, blurring the lines between country, swing, and hot jazz. And then there were songs like his Talkin' Blues, which demonstrated his mastery of the comedic monologue, a style that would influence countless country and folk artists to come. He had conquered California. He was a recording star, a dance hall king, and a respected peer of the genre's biggest names. And then he got the call that would change everything. In the world of country music in the 1940s, all roads ultimately led to one place: Nashville, Tennessee, and the Grand Ole Opry. The Opry was the mother church of country music, a live radio show broadcast every Saturday night across the nation on WSM's powerful Clear Channel signal. To be made a member of the Opry was the ultimate seal of approval. It meant you had arrived. It offered a national platform, unparalleled prestige, and a level of stardom that even the biggest California dance halls couldn't provide. In 1945, that call came for Hank Penny. His decision to accept and move to Nashville was a seismic one. He was leaving the vibrant, experimental, and lucrative heartland of Western swing for the deeply conservative, traditionalist capital of country music. It was a culture shock of epic proportions. The Nashville of the 1940s was wary of outsiders and suspicious of new sounds. The Opry had a strict, almost religious adherence to what it considered authentic country music. This meant acoustic instruments, heartfelt ballads, and a certain down-home, no-frills presentation. Into this formal, hallowed institution walked Hank Penny, a foreign ambassador from the wild, swinging West. He brought with him a sound and a style that must have seemed alien to the Nashville establishment. He brought drums, an instrument that was heavily discouraged and rarely seen on the Opry stage at the time. While pioneers like Pee Wee King had already challenged this taboo, Penny's regular use of a full rhythm section was crucial in helping to normalize a more modern sound within the institution. He brought an amplified steel guitar, played not with the mournful cry of traditional country, but with the hot, jazzy phrasing of Noel Boggs. He brought sophisticated arrangements and a repertoire that owed as much to Duke Ellington as it did to the Carter family. His arrival was a quiet revolution, and his secret weapon, the tool he used to win over the skeptical Opry audience and its powerful gatekeepers, was his humor. Hank Penny was, without a doubt, one of the funniest men ever to grace the Ryman stage. He understood that a joke could be a Trojan horse. He could disarm the most hardened traditionalists with a perfectly timed one-liner, and once they were laughing, their ears were more open to the adventurous music that followed. His comedic routines with fellow Opry star Minnie Pearl became legendary. He wasn't just a singer who told a few jokes, he was a co-equal comedian and musical pioneer. His impact on the Opry was profound and deeply underappreciated. By simply doing his act week after week, he began to slowly normalize the sounds and instruments of Western swing within the citadel of country music. The presence of drums on his records and eventually on the stage began to chip away at the long-standing taboo. His featuring of hot instrumental solos pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on a show that typically prized the singer above all else. He was a progressive force, gently but persistently stretching the definition of country music from the inside out. He was a vital link, paving the way for the rockabilly revolution of the 1950s and the more eclectic sounds that would follow. He was a beloved Opry star for several years, a constant presence on its nationwide broadcasts and a headliner on its grueling package tours. He was at the very center of the country music universe, but the fit was never quite perfect. The very things that made him unique, his eclecticism, his jazz sensibilities, his refusal to be just one thing, also prevented him from being fully embraced by the Nashville machine. This is where the story grows more complex. While he was a star, he never ascended to the top tier of Nashville royalty like his contemporaries Roy Acuff or Ernest Tubb. There were whispers that the Nashville establishment didn't quite know what to do with him. Was he a singer, a comedian, a jazz musician in a cowboy hat? In a town that thrived on clear, marketable categories, Hank Penny defied easy classification. Some felt his comedy, as popular as it was, overshadowed his musical genius, preventing him from being seen as a serious artist in the mournful, heartfelt Nashville mold. The rigid structure of the Opry and the relentless grind of the Nashville touring circuit also began to wear on his freewheeling improvisational spirit. Life in Nashville was more regimented, less creatively spontaneous than the wide-open dance hall culture of California. For a man who thrived on invention and unpredictability, the Nashville dream, for all its prestige, may have started to feel like a beautiful gilded cage. He had brought the swing to Nashville, but Nashville was never going to fully swing with him. The pioneer had made his mark. He had opened the door for others, but he realized his own heart was still out west. After several successful years, he made another life-altering decision. He left the security and prestige of the Grand Ole Opry and headed back to California. He had conquered the West Coast. He had made his mark on Nashville, but the ultimate top-tier stardom that he seemed destined for had remained just out of reach. He was returning to his adopted home, but the musical world he was returning to was not the same one he had left behind. A new sound was on the horizon, one that would soon eclipse even the mighty Western swing, and Hank Penny would once again have to find his place in a rapidly changing world. Hank Penny's time in Nashville was a profound success, yet also a profound lesson. He had proven that his innovative swinging sound could not only survive but thrive on country music's most sacred stage. But he also learned that the rigid structure and traditionalist heart of the Nashville machine could never fully accommodate his restless, eclectic spirit. His departure was not a retreat, but a strategic choice to return to a world of greater creative freedom. The only problem was that while he had been away changing Nashville, a new musical revolution was brewing that was about to change the entire world. What does a pioneer do when the frontier he helped to settle is suddenly unrecognizable? What happens to an innovator when the world he innovated for simply vanishes? For Hank Penny, leaving the Grand Ole Opry in the early 1950s and heading back to his adopted home of California was not a retreat, but a strategic repositioning in a world that was changing with dizzying speed. He was a man caught between two worlds, the freewheeling, improvisational kingdom of Western swing he had helped to build, and the structured traditionalist empire of Nashville he had helped to modernize. Now he was about to face a third and far more powerful force, a glowing electric box that was rapidly becoming the new center of the American universe. The California Hank Penny returned to was not the same one he had left. The golden age of the grand dance halls was over. The massive crowds that had once flocked to hear the big swing bands were dwindling. A new sound, a new energy was crackling in the air. It was a rebellious, stripped down, and electrifying music called rock and roll. Teenagers who a few years earlier might have been jitterbugging to Spade Cooley were now screaming for Elvis Presley and Bill Haley. Western swing, with its large, expensive bands and sophisticated jazz arrangements, suddenly felt like the music of a previous generation. For a bandleader whose entire career was built on keeping the dance floor full, the emptying of the ballrooms was an existential crisis. Many of his contemporaries, the great kings of swing, struggled to adapt. Some faded into obscurity, others tried awkwardly to incorporate the new rock and roll beat, but Hank Penny possessed an advantage that many of them did not. He was, and always had been, a complete entertainer. His value was not just in his music, but in his personality, his charisma, and his lightning-quick comedic mind. And as one door was closing, another, much bigger one, was opening. The age of radio dominance was giving way to the age of television. Early television in the 1950s was a wild, untamed frontier. Much of it was broadcast live, creating a chaotic, anything-can-happen energy that was a perfect fit for a performer like Hank. The television variety show was becoming a staple of American family life, a place where singers, dancers, comedians, and actors could ply their trades in front of millions. For a man who had spent decades honing his skills on live radio and unpredictable stages, television was a natural fit. Hank Penny, the consummate showman, reinvented himself once again, this time as a television personality. He became a fixture on the West Coast television scene, hosting his own variety program, The Hank Penny Show, for a time. He was also a frequent and beloved guest star on the nationally syndicated country music shows that were gaining immense popularity, most notably Red Foley's Ozark Jubilee. On these programs, Hank was in his element. He could sing a country ballad, lead his band through a hot swing number, and then effortlessly pivot to a hilarious comedy sketch with the host. He was charming, professional, and endlessly watchable. He understood the intimacy of the new medium, the way a raised eyebrow or a sly grin could connect with a viewer sitting in their living room hundreds of miles away. He had successfully navigated a career transition that ended the careers of many of his peers. But this success came with a subtle and complex cost. It began to cement a narrative that had followed him for years. The struggle between Hank Penny, the comedian, and Hank Penny, the serious musician. On television, a 3-minute comedy routine was often more effective and memorable than a complex 6-minute instrumental arrangement featuring multiple improvised solos. To the vast television audience, he was increasingly known as the funny guy from the country music show, a charming personality first and a groundbreaking musician second. This created a deep and likely frustrating paradox for him. His humor was the very thing that made him accessible, that opened the doors to conservative Nashville and mainstream television. Yet it also may have prevented him from being held in the same rarefied esteem as the more stoic, serious artists of his day. He was a victim of his own versatility. In a world that loves to put artists into neat little boxes, Hank Penny defiantly remained a jack of all trades, and in the process was denied the title of Master of One. One can only imagine the internal conflict for a man who had led some of the hottest and most respected bands in the country, now finding his legacy being defined more by his punchlines than by his musical innovations. Despite his focus on television, he never stopped being a bandleader and a crucial mentor to young talent. And it was during this period, in the mid-1950s, that he made one of his most significant and almost entirely overlooked contributions to the future of popular music. A teenage guitar prodigy from Louisiana, a boy who was creating a revolutionary new style of playing that blended country, blues, and R&B, was making a name for himself. His name was James Burton. Hank Penny heard him, recognized the revolutionary talent, and hired the young guitarist for his television band. For a young James Burton, this was one of his first major, high-profile professional gigs. Playing alongside a seasoned pro like Hank, night after night on live television, was an invaluable education. And for the world, it was a quiet, almost unseen passing of the torch. Hank Penny, the pioneer who had helped bring the swinging electric sounds of the 1940s to the mainstream, was now providing a platform for the young gunslinger whose fiery hybrid guitar licks would go on to define the sound of rock and roll, playing on iconic records with Ricky Nelson, Elvis Presley, and countless others. Hank's influence was once again acting as a crucial yet nearly invisible bridge between musical eras. Throughout the 1950s and into the 60s, Hank continued to record, though with less commercial success. He flirted with the new sounds, cutting records that had a distinct rockabilly edge, proving he was still listening, still curious. He also settled more into his personal life, eventually marrying singer and songwriter Sherry Sheely, a union that was significant both personally and professionally. But as the 1960s progressed, the world of television entertainment changed again. The loose vaudeville-style variety shows of the 50s gave way to more polished, scripted programming. The raw energy of live broadcasting was replaced by the safety of videotape. For an old-school spontaneous entertainer like Hank, the landscape was becoming less hospitable. His television career gradually wound down. He found a final, comfortable home for his immense talents in the burgeoning entertainment scene of Las Vegas and Reno. He became a beloved and respected lounge act, a perfect fit for a performer who could effortlessly blend music and comedy. For many performers of his generation, a long-running Vegas gig was a dignified and lucrative way to cap a career. He could entertain, lead a tight band, and make a good living, all without the brutal grind of constant touring. He was no longer a national star on the cutting edge, but he was a working, respected professional, an elder statesman of a bygone era. He had successfully navigated nearly 4 decades of seismic shifts in the American entertainment industry. He had gone from a banjo-picking kid in Alabama to a radio star, a dance hall king in California, a pioneering Opry member in Nashville, a national television personality, and finally a polished Las Vegas headliner. It was a career of astonishing adaptability. But with each transformation, each necessary reinvention, his identity as the groundbreaking architect of Western swing grew a little more distant, a little fainter to the general public. The pioneer had survived, but his legacy was becoming lost in the fog of his own multifaceted success. His final chapter, and the quiet battle for his place in history, was about to begin. Through sheer talent and an almost unparalleled ability to adapt, Hank Penny had navigated the most turbulent decades in the history of American entertainment. He survived the death of the big bands, the rise of rock and roll, and the dawn of television, reinventing himself at every turn. Yet, each successful transformation took him further from his origins as a groundbreaking musical architect and closer to the persona of a universally likable entertainer. Now, as he settled into the final stage of his long career, the ultimate question remained: after all the laughter and all the applause, what would be the lasting measure of the man and his art? What is the final act for a pioneer? What happens when the frontiers have all been explored, the revolutions have all been fought, and the world has moved on to new battles and new heroes? For an artist like Hank Penny, a man who had been a perpetual motion machine of adaptation and reinvention, the final chapter was not one of dramatic decline, but of masterful consolidation. He had been a radio star, a dance hall king, a Nashville innovator, and a television personality. Now, as the 1960s rolled into the 70s, he settled into the last great role of his career, that of the consummate Las Vegas showman. The Las Vegas of that era was the undisputed entertainment capital of the world. It was a desert oasis of glamour, a place where the greatest performers of a generation held court. While the superstars played the main showrooms, a vibrant and equally important scene thrived in the city's intimate casino lounges. This was a world built for true professionals, for entertainers who could hold an audience for hours on end, night after night. It was a world made for Hank Penny. In the Vegas lounges, all the disparate threads of his long career came together in a perfect, polished tapestry. Here, he wasn't just a country singer or just a comedian. He was a complete entertainer. He could lead his tight professional band through a set of sophisticated swing tunes for the discerning listeners, tell stories that had the room in stitches, and sing a heartfelt country ballad that could bring a tear to the eye. The lounge was the ideal venue for his unique blend of talents. The intimacy of the room allowed his quick wit and warm personality to shine, creating a powerful connection with his audience. For years, he was a beloved and fixture in the city, a master of his craft, respected by his peers, and adored by the crowds who came to see a true professional at work. This was not a sad epilogue to a fading career. It was the logical and dignified final stage for one of America's great all-around performers. But time, as it always does, marches on. As the 1970s progressed, Hank gradually began to withdraw from the relentless grind of the Vegas show schedule. A lifetime spent on the road, under the hot lights, and in the demanding world of live performance takes its toll. He had been a professional entertainer for nearly 40 years, a marathon career by any standard. He settled into a quieter life, a well-earned semi-retirement, still playing occasional gigs but no longer chasing the spotlight. It was during this period of quiet retreat that the history of country music was being formally written and codified by journalists, academics, and institutions like the Country Music Hall of Fame. And as that official narrative took shape, a curious and tragic omission began to occur. The story of country music was increasingly told as a straight, linear progression centered almost exclusively on Nashville. The vital, vibrant, and incredibly influential contributions of the West Coast scenes and pioneers like Hank Penny were often relegated to the footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. Several factors contributed to this historical oversight. Hank's departure from Nashville meant he wasn't there to personally tend to his legacy within the industry's power structure. His defiant eclecticism made him difficult to categorize. He didn't fit neatly into the honky-tonk box or the singing cowboy box. And his profound success as a comedian had, ironically, cemented an image that sometimes overshadowed his immense importance as a musical innovator. The history books were being written, and Hank Penny was being written out of them. But just as his legacy seemed destined to be lost to all but the most dedicated connoisseurs, a new generation of musicians began a vital work of cultural archaeology. In the 1970s and 80s, a Western swing revival movement began to bubble up, led by bands like the Grammy-winning Asleep at the Wheel. These were young players who had grown up listening to rock and roll, but had fallen in love with the hot, sophisticated sounds of Bob Wills, Milton Brown, and their forgotten contemporaries. They were musical scholars, digging through dusty record bins, transcribing old solos, and reintroducing this incredible music to a new audience. This revival sparked a renewed, albeit niche, interest in the original pioneers. Suddenly, figures like Hank Penny were being sought out by a new generation of reporters, musicians, and fans. They wanted to hear the stories firsthand, to learn from the masters. This period must have brought a measure of quiet validation for Hank. After decades of being overlooked by the mainstream, here were young, talented musicians celebrating his work, acknowledging his influence, and ensuring that the music he had dedicated his life to would not be forgotten. It was a grace note in the final years of his life, a reminder that true influence often outlives fleeting fame. Hank Penny passed away from a heart attack in April of 1992 at the age of 73. His death was not front-page news. There were no grand, nationally televised tributes. It was the quiet passing of a man who had spent his life making a joyous, brilliant noise, now leaving behind a silence that was felt most deeply by those who knew just how much he had contributed. So what is the final true legacy of this forgotten pioneer? How do we measure the impact of a man who was always a moving target? His legacy is not a single monumental achievement, but a series of vital foundational contributions that ripple through American music to this day. He was the quintessential bridge. He built a bridge between the hot jazz of the city and the rustic heart of country music. He built a bridge between the freewheeling innovation of the West Coast and the hallowed traditionalist halls of the Grand Ole Opry. And most importantly, he built a bridge for the audience, using his universal language of humor to make adventurous, sophisticated music accessible and fun for everyone. He was the quiet pioneer. On the most important stage in country music, he championed the use of drums and electric instruments, fighting a subtle battle against a rigid establishment. In doing so, he helped crack open the door for the rockabilly rebels and future generations of artists who would continue to modernize the genre. And he was the generous mentor. In a famously competitive business, he had an eye for talent and a spirit of collaboration. His decision to hire a teenage James Burton was not just a footnote, it was a direct, tangible link between the first generation of Western swing and the birth of the rock and roll guitar hero. In the end, perhaps Hank Penny was overlooked precisely because he was so multi-talented. He refused to be just one thing, and in a world that craves simple labels, his complexity became a commercial disadvantage. His story is a powerful, poignant reminder that the loudest voices aren't always the most important ones, and that history is full of architects who work quietly in the shadows while others build empires on the foundations they laid. Hank Penny's ultimate legacy isn't found in a museum or on a chart of #1 hits. It's in the echo of a swinging guitar solo, in the cadence of a perfectly delivered punchline, and in the spirit of fearless innovation. We just have to know where to tune the dial to find it. He was the entertainer's entertainer, the musician's musician, a true American original, and he deserves, at long last, to be remembered.